The morning begins with a muted grayness that never quite lifts over Rainharbor, the kind of coastal haze that settles into the town's bones. On the hillside above the inlet, a small house sits behind an aging cedar fence, its yard slick with dew that glistens under the weak light. A marked sedan is parked at the curb. Another unmarked car rests just behind it. Neighbors stand at their windows, their silhouettes unmoving, as if afraid that shifting even slightly might break whatever quiet spell has fallen across the street. Detective Mara Ellison approaches the front steps with a steadiness born from years of cold case work, the kind that teaches a person to walk slowly toward truth, because rushing it never ends well. The porch boards creak under her weight, a soft complaint rising into the morning air. Before she reaches the door, she glances back at the cluster of homes nearby rain-dark roofs, familiar bikes left on porches, the faint smell of wet cedar carried in from the ravine. Everything looks so ordinary, and that is precisely what makes this moment ache with significance. For decades, the question had always been whether the danger had come from somewhere else. Now she knows it had lived right here. A man answers the door. His expression is caught between confusion and a guarded recognition he tries to mask. He looks older than his years, worn by time, but there is still a strange stillness in him, the same quietness neighbors once described without suspicion. Behind him, the interior is dim and bare, as though the house itself has learned to shrink inward over time. Ellison reads the warrant. The man barely reacts, as if the words arrive from a distant place he long stopped believing would come for him. Officers move past her, guiding him out onto the porch. The neighbors linger behind curtains, their faces pale against the glass. Some recognize him. Others realize with a chill that they had seen him often at the grocery store, at the park, walking alone by the footbridge, and never once considered what he might have carried inside his silence. As he is placed into the back of the waiting car, Ellison's gaze shifts to his yard. A rusted tricycle leans against the fence, left by the previous tenants years before he moved in. Its front wheel turns slightly in the breeze, a small, unsettling reminder of how childhood objects often remain long after their owners have grown or vanished. The image catches at something deep in her memory, an older photograph in the heart file. The teal bicycle tipped near a picnic table at Maple Crest Park, the last trace of a girl who never made it home. Down the hill, the inlet lies flat and metallic under the clouded sky. Few sounds rise from the shipyard. The cranes stand motionless, and even the gulls seem reluctant to break the quiet. Rainharbor holds its breath as the patrol car pulls away, slipping down the narrow street like a slow-moving realization settling over the town. No one cheers, no one calls out. The truth is too heavy for celebration. It hums beneath the surface like a taut wire, unspoken, undeniable. Ellison remains on the porch for a moment longer, letting the morning seep into her awareness. She thinks of the Hart family, of the weight they have carried for 32 years, of the unseen thread that has finally pulled tight. The air smells of wet wood and distant salt, a scent she associates with both endings and beginnings. Somewhere in the ravine beyond the houses, water moves in a thin, steady trickle over stones, unchanged by the decades that altered everything else. She steps off the porch and walks toward her car, each footfall quiet on the damp pavement. The neighbors slowly retreat from their windows. Life resumes its familiar shape, but something inside it has shifted. The boundaries between safety and danger have redrawn themselves, revealing that the truth had always been closer than anyone wanted to believe. As Ellison opens the car door, she allows herself a final glance up the hill. The house stands still behind the fence, as if trying to fold itself back into anonymity, but the spell is broken now. What was hidden is no longer unseen. To understand how this began, we go back to 1987. Rainharbor often wakes slowly, as if the town needs time to remember itself. On most mornings, Lydia Hart is the first one up in the small blue house at the end of Harborview Lane. She moves quietly through the kitchen, careful not to wake her younger sisters as she fills the kettle and spreads peanut butter on toast. The family budget doesn't allow for much variety, but Lydia has a way of making small routines feel warm. She writes notes for her sisters' lunchboxes, tiny jokes or doodles that she tapes to the inside of the lids. Her handwriting is neat and rounded, the kind of script teachers always praise. Before the kettle whistles, she slips her notebook off the counter. It's a worn composition book with stickers peeling at the corners. She writes in it in short bursts whenever she has a moment, a place for sketches, lists, and small observations, like how rain sounds different when it hits the roof at night. She keeps it close, but not hidden. For her, privacy is less about secrecy and more about holding space for her thoughts. When her sisters shuffle into the kitchen, still wrapped in morning sleep, Lydia brightens. She hands them their lunches and straightens the collar of Sarah's shirt while reminding Megan to wear her thicker socks. Their mother watches from the hallway, quietly grateful for Lydia's sense of responsibility. In many ways, Lydia is the thread that holds the household together, helping to keep mornings from unraveling into chaos. School is a short ride away, downhill toward the inlet. Lydia unlocks her teal bicycle from the porch railing. Its frame is scuffed but lovingly maintained. She enjoys fixing small things, tightening bolts, cleaning grease from the chain. Part of it is necessity, part is pride. The bike gives her freedom, a way to explore corners of Rainharbor she might never see on foot, as she treats it with the same care she gives her sisters. Most mornings, she and her best friend, Marin, meet at the bend in the road. Marin is more talkative, filling the air with stories about her older brother, her new art project, or rumors from school. Lydia listens with a soft smile, adding comments only when she feels they matter. Their friendship isn't built on equal amounts of words, but on the comfort of knowing someone is riding beside you. At school, Lydia stands out quietly. Teachers describe her as dependable, thoughtful, and unusually mature. She never seeks attention. When class ends, she lingers in the hallways, noticing the small things. Other students rush past flyers curling at the edges on the bulletin boards, the smell of chalk dust near the stairwell, the way sunlight pools beneath the row of windows facing the courtyard. Her favorite class is music. Though she isn't the strongest musician, she loves the feeling of being surrounded by sound, each instrument blending with the next the way different parts of her life overlap: home, school, neighborhood, the forest she explores on her bike. She has a habit of tapping gentle rhythms with her fingers when she thinks no one is looking. On weekends, she rides with her sisters to Maple Crest Park, a place stitched into the landscape of their childhood. The park is perched on a hill where evergreen trees lean inward as though guarding the trails below. To adults, it's just a patch of green. To children, it's a world of its own: wooded pathways, hidden corners, the footbridge crossing a shallow ravine. Lydia knows which trails become muddy after rain and which spots hold the best clusters of spring flowers. She's protective of her sisters, always checking behind her to make sure they haven't fallen too far behind. When they pause to rest at the picnic tables, she leans her teal bike against the fence and helps them unpack snacks. She tells them stories she invents on the spot, tales about imaginary creatures that live beneath the bridge or in the tallest pine tree. The sisters listen with wide-eyed trust, hanging on every detail. Small symbolic habits shape her days. She always loops her left shoelace twice, believing it keeps her grounded. She touches her bike seat before each ride, not for luck, but as a quiet promise to herself to return safely. Her notebook holds lists of places she hopes to visit someday: Portland's bookstores, the ocean cliffs 2 hours north, even just a different town where no one knows her name. Lydia dreams modestly but with sincerity. Her world is small, but she feels its edges expanding. On the Friday before everything changes, the Hart household feels almost weightless. Their mother finishes work early. Their father brings home leftover pastries from the shipyard cafeteria. Lydia and her sisters sit on the living room floor reading comics. The mood is simple, unremarkable, The kind of evening that never gets written into memory, because nothing extraordinary happens. Saturday dawns with a thin fog hugging the rooftops. The sisters ask if they can ride to the park again. Their mother hesitates. She has errands to run, and Lydia's responsibilities often fall heavier on her than on other children her age. But Lydia reassures her. She promises to keep a close eye on her sisters and to return home by lunchtime. Her mother agrees, trusting the girl who has earned that trust 100 times over. Before leaving, Lydia checks her bike carefully. She wipes a faint streak of dirt from the frame, tests the brakes, and adjusts the strap on the small pouch attached to the handlebars. It's a ritual she never rushes. Her sisters tug at her impatience, ready to go, but Lydia insists on finishing. Only once she's satisfied does she lift the bike onto the street, guiding it with the familiarity of a friend. The ride to the park is easy. The downhill slope carries them quickly past familiar houses and hedges thick with dew. The air smells of cedar mulch and early spring. When they arrive at Maple Crest Park, Lydia picks the same picnic table, as always close enough to the trail entrance to see people coming and going, far enough from the main road to feel tucked away. They spend the morning exploring the edges of the ravine, tossing pine cones into the creek, and chasing the echo of their laughter between the trees. As lunchtime approaches, Lydia decides to ride to the deli 2 blocks away to buy sandwiches. It's a small errand, one she has done many times before. Her sisters sit on the picnic bench, swinging their feet, tracing lines on the dirt with sticks. She tells them she'd be right back. She gives them the same look she always does before stepping away, a soft warning, protective but not stern. Her bike stands ready beside her, the teal frame catching what little sunlight breaks through the overcast sky. Lydia swings her leg over the seat and begins to pedal, her silhouette moving down the path with practiced ease. The sisters watch her go, expecting her to return within minutes. They do not know that this quiet, ordinary departure will be the last time they see their sister alive. They do not know that her bicycle, so cherished and carefully maintained, will soon become the ghostly marker of a childhood that ended too soon. And as the trails curve behind her and the faint hum of her tires disappears into the muted sounds of Rainharbor, the world carries on unaware that something irreversible has just begun. The day Lydia Hart disappeared began without warning, quiet and unremarkable in every way. Around mid-morning, the mist that held Rainharbor in its usual grip began to lift, thinning just enough for light to wash over the park and brighten the surface of the picnic tables. The air smelled of damp bark and earth warming after a long stretch of cold nights. Children's voices drifted across the hill, carried by a breeze threading through the evergreens. At 11:42 a.m., according to the deli's receipt that would later become a key timestamp, Lydia left her sisters at the picnic table beside the fence. She told them she'd be back in a few minutes, lifting her teal bicycle upright with the easy confidence of someone who has done the same errand countless times. The sisters watched her pedal toward the path, the front wheel catching a muted flash of light before she rounded the curve and disappeared from view. The park felt safe, familiar. Nothing in its narrow trails or the sprawling shadows beneath the footbridge suggested danger. Yet in those simple minutes, Lydia's path intersected with the quiet movements of someone else, someone who noticed her, someone who did not intend to let her return to the picnic table waiting for her. By noon, the sisters had grown restless. They swung their legs under the table, whispering guesses about which sandwiches Lydia might bring back. When she did not appear, they assumed the deli line was long, or she had stopped to talk to a neighbor. They were children, and children seldom consider that an absence might be the border of a much larger threat. At 12:16 p.m., a jogger passing near the footbridge thought he heard something down the ravine. He later described it only as a disturbance in the quiet something, not quite fitting with the steady rush of the creek. He paused, looked around, saw no one, and continued on. At the time, it seemed insignificant. Later, he would replay that moment again and again, wondering if he had heard the final struggle of a girl he never met. Around 12:30 p.m., the sisters walked toward the path Lydia had taken, expecting to see her riding back. On the edge of the trail, half-tipped against the fence, stood the teal bicycle. It had not been there earlier. The handlebars glistened with a sheen of moisture, as though it had been gripped recently. The sisters approached it cautiously, unsure why Lydia would leave it behind. They called her name, their voices thin in the heavy stillness. When she didn't answer, panic began to bloom quietly in their chests. Their mother arrived minutes later, alerted by a neighbor who saw the girls wandering near the entrance of the park, with worry pulling at their expressions. When she reached the picnic tables and saw the bike abandoned, a kind of instinct rose in her, a cold certainty that something was wrong. She called for Lydia until her voice cracked. She walked the trails again and again, shouting her daughter's name into pockets of silence. At 12:52 p.m., she dialed emergency services. Her voice trembled as she explained that her oldest daughter had gone to run a simple errand and had not returned. The dispatcher's questions felt oddly methodical. What was she wearing? Did she have a jacket? Did she ever walk off the path? When the call ended, the mother pressed her hand against the fence as though trying to steady the world that had suddenly tipped on its axis. By 1:10 p.m., 2 officers arrived. They walked the main trail, then the side trails, scanning for signs of a turned wheel, footprints, anything disturbed. They noted the teal bicycle's position, the way the front wheel was angled slightly inward toward the trees rather than toward the picnic area. One officer pointed out that the bike seemed carefully placed, not dropped or flung. That small detail stayed with him longer than he expected. At 1:27 p.m., a group of volunteers, neighbors, parents, dog walkers spread out across the park. Some searched the open grass, some the clusters of trees near the restrooms, others the brush lining the ravine. Rainharbor had not seen a disappearance like this in years. Within minutes, word spread through the neighborhood and toward the shipyard. People closed their shops early. Teachers cut their lunch breaks short. The quiet hum of the community shifted into a collective worry. The ravine itself cut like a thin wound through the park, a steep decline lined with stones darkened by moisture. A narrow trail led from the footbridge down to the creek, but it had gone unused in recent days. Mud had drained into dry patterns, forming a thin crust along the edge of the slope. When the officers reached the bridge and looked down, sunlight dappled the surface of the water below, broken only by the scattered leaves drifting through the current. At 2:05 p.m., an officer spotted something unusual near a cluster of moss-covered rocks, a flash of color against the muted palette of the ravine. He motioned for the others to join him. When they reached the base of the slope, they followed the faint disturbance in the brush. A few branches were bent, not broken, as though someone had moved through hurriedly, but not with enough force to leave a dramatic trail. The flash of color was a piece of fabric pale yellow, torn along one side. It matched the description the mother had given of Lydia's shirt. The officer knelt and touched the edge. It felt cool, not yet dried by the afternoon air. Nearby, the earth showed signs of recent pressure, the kind formed by weight shifting unevenly. Further down, near the creek's edge, they saw what they had been dreading: a small shoe, muddy at the heel and resting on its side. At 2:11 p.m., they found her body. There was no chaos in that moment, no dramatic cries or shouted commands. Only a stunned, heavy silence settled over the ravine as the officers realized the search had ended in the worst possible way. One officer radioed the discovery, his voice steady but strained. Another stood with his hands at his sides, absorbing the stillness of the girl who would not be going home. The area around her held scattered details that would later become the backbone of the investigation. Her hair was slightly damp, though it had not rained that afternoon. Pine needles clung to the back of her shirt. There were faint drag marks in the soil, not deep enough to indicate a long struggle, but present enough to suggest she had been moved. A partial shoe impression lay near the trailhead, larger than Lydia's, angled oddly, as though whoever left it had slipped or turned sharply while climbing back toward the bridge. Further up the ravine, branches showed small abrasions consistent with someone gripping them for support. Investigators would later reconstruct that path countless times, trying to determine whether the person had approached from the bridge or the lower trail. No single answer fit perfectly. The ravine seemed to hold fragments of the truth, scattered like puzzle pieces refusing to align. A jogger who had passed earlier returned, breathless, explaining the sound he'd heard before continuing on. He couldn't describe it clearly, only that it felt out of place. His uncertainty added a strange weight to the scene evidence that signs had been present but overlooked in the ordinary hum of the day. As officers secured the area, the late afternoon light shifted, filtering between the trees and casting long, thin shadows across the creek. A few leaves drifted onto the rocks beside Lydia, settling gently as though trying to cover what had been exposed. The silence became sharper, almost metallic, mingling with the cold air rising from the water. At 3:40 p.m., the medical examiner arrived. Measurements were taken, temperatures recorded, distances notated with careful precision. Nothing was rushed. Even the smallest detail might hold significance. Investigators noted the time gap from her departure to her discovery, just under 3 hours. A narrow, devastating window in which an entire life had been altered. And then, as evidence bags were prepared and photographs taken, one detail emerged that did not match the rest. Near the bend where the ravine met the trail, partially hidden beneath a layer of fallen needles, a small object lay in the dirt. It was a metal ring from a zipper, circular and cold to the touch. It did not match the clothing Lydia had worn. It did not match the belongings of her sisters or the items found at the picnic table. It was something else left behind, or dropped, or broken off, a clue with no immediate explanation. As the sun lowered behind the hillside and cast the ravine into deeper shadow, the officers marked the spot and placed the object into a sealed evidence envelope. They did not yet know whether it belonged to the person who had taken Lydia's life, or whether it was an unrelated scrap lost in the passage of time. But its presence felt wrong, like a whisper of a story that had not yet been told. The search ended at dusk, with the trail closed and neighbors gathered in stunned clusters at the park entrance. Whispers moved through the crowd like a slow, rising fog. People who had walked those trails for years found themselves staring into the trees as if seeing them for the first time, as if realizing that the darkness beneath the branches could hold far more than they ever imagined. And the teal bicycle remained near the fence, untouched, standing as the last witness to the moment Lydia rode away. In the early months after Lydia's death, the investigation moved with urgency. Rainharbor had not seen a crime of this nature in decades, and the department put every available officer on rotation. Yet urgency does not guarantee clarity, and the first cracks in the investigation began to appear within weeks. The zipper ring found near the bend of the ravine was catalogued, photographed, and tested. It held no fingerprints. No fibers clung to it. The metal yielded no manufacturer mark that could be tied to a specific jacket or bag. One detective suggested it might have belonged to a hiker. Another thought it could have broken off Lydia's own clothing until the family confirmed her shirt had no zipper at all. The object sat in an evidence drawer, too significant to discard, too ambiguous to direct the case forward. The first major lead came from a witness who claimed he saw a stranger near the entrance of Maple Crest Park on the day of the disappearance. The man was described as tall, wearing a green jacket with dark hair tucked beneath a baseball cap. Officers canvassed the area, looking for anyone who matched the description. For a moment, the department felt a surge of hope. But by the end of the week, the witness admitted he had actually seen the man days before the incident, not the day of. A simple mix-up in memory. The lead collapsed. Another lead appeared when a teenage boy reported seeing an older man walking near the ravine around noon. He believed the man had been watching someone through the trees. Investigators pulled yearbooks, employment rosters, and neighborhood directories. They questioned men who resembled the sketch derived from the boy's recollection. Most had routine explanations for their whereabouts: walking to work, collecting kindling, checking on pets. One man admitted he sometimes wandered the trails during lunch breaks to clear his mind. His nervousness drew suspicion, and he agreed to searches, interviews, and tests with brittle patience. But nothing tied him to Lydia. Eventually he was released, though Rainharbor never fully erased the shadow cast upon him by the investigation. Media coverage surged as weeks turned into months. Outside Rainharbor, reporters framed the case as a haunting reminder of how quickly innocence could vanish. News crews swarmed the footbridge and park entrance. Some residents cooperated. Others refused to answer questions, feeling that the intrusion worsened their grief. Lydia's mother, Elaine, gave one careful statement early on, her voice tight as she said her daughter had been the kindest soul in our home. After that, she retreated from the public eye. She wanted answers, not attention. The police department held periodic press briefings. Their updates grew increasingly vague as time passed. One reporter pressed an officer, asking if the department believed the killer was a stranger passing through or someone local. The officer hesitated, then said only that all possibilities remained open. The hesitation was noted by everyone in the room. Investigators constructed timelines on large boards across the briefing room. They marked known movements, witness statements, and the approximate time of death. They interviewed deli workers, joggers, dog walkers, teenagers who used the trails, and men who lived alone in the surrounding streets. Some provided genuine recollections. Others offered guesses clouded by fear or the desire to be helpful. The timeline grew crowded, inconsistent, and increasingly difficult to parse. A man working at the shipyard became a focus for several months. He had a minor criminal record and a history of volatility during arguments. He also lived within walking distance of the park. Officers seized clothing, boots, and equipment from his home. For days, Rainharbor waited for the announcement of an arrest. But forensic tests showed no connection between him and the scene. The pressure to find a culprit had turned suspicion into momentum into error. The department released the man publicly and apologized privately. He left the town the following year. Years passed. The investigation shifted from urgent to methodical to stagnant. Detectives retired or transferred. Boxes of evidence were moved from the active unit to long-term storage. The edges of the folders browned with age. Photographs faded slightly in their sleeves. The family grew accustomed to a quiet that no one wanted to acknowledge as acceptance. Every few years, a new detective took over the cold case, hoping to bring fresh eyes. One such detective, a younger officer named Harold Jeffers, tried rebuilding the case from scratch. He interviewed Lydia's sisters, who were older now, their memories both sharpened and softened by time. He walked every path they described. He noted the angle of the bicycle near the fence. He felt certain the positioning meant something, that the bike had been placed deliberately, not dropped in haste. But without additional evidence, his theory remained only that, a theory. He focused on the drag marks in the ravine, believing they suggested the killer had used a route less visible from the footbridge. Jeffers proposed that the perpetrator may have approached from the side trail rather than the main path. Some colleagues supported the idea. Others doubted it, noting how easily soil can shift under even mild environmental pressure. Debates filled meeting rooms, but no conclusive proof surfaced. In one interview, a neighbor swore she had seen a blue truck parked unusually close to the park entrance on the day of the crime. She recalled the truck's dented bumper. Investigators searched registration records, looked for matching vehicles, and even pulled archives of local traffic tickets. 2 potential owners were questioned. One had been at work during the critical time window. The other had loaned his truck to a cousin who lived several towns away. After months of scrutiny, investigators concluded the sighting either pertained to a different day or involved a completely uninvolved party. Wrong leads hardened into familiar disappointments. Detectives grew tired of seeing the same patterns repeat: hope, pursuit, uncertainty, collapse. Dialogue in the department became brief and subdued. "Anything new?" Jeffers would ask a colleague as they passed in the hallway. "Nothing solid," was often the answer. The tone of those exchanges changed over time. They began as expressions of determination and slowly evolved into quiet acceptance. The Hart family continued to attend annual check-ins with the department. These meetings were polite, careful, and emotionally exhausting. Officers would outline recent attempts, describe why certain suspects were eliminated, and reaffirm that the case had not been forgotten. Elaine listened with measured composure, though each meeting carved new lines into her expression. The younger sisters, now teenagers, rarely spoke during these sessions. Sometimes they exchanged glances that said more than words could: hope thinning, resilience wearing down. During one such meeting, Elaine asked a question that lingered in the room long after it was spoken. "Do you think it was someone from here?" The detective paused, looked down at the file in front of him, then said he didn't want to speculate. The silence that followed said enough. By the 10th anniversary, the investigation had settled into a familiar rhythm. Small tips emerged, were examined, and fell apart. Advances in forensic science offered possibilities, but none strong enough to compensate for the degraded nature of the original samples. DNA profiling methods of the early years were limited. Lydia's case consistently fell into gaps: too old for certain techniques, too compromised for others. Detectives often felt they were standing at the edge of a field where they could see the outline of truth, but not the details required to reach it. In the late 1990s, a man in a nearby town was arrested for an unrelated assault. Rumors spread quickly. People speculated that he might be linked to Lydia's death. When officers questioned him, he denied ever being in Rainharbor. His alibi placed him with co-workers on the day of the crime. Forensic comparison ruled him out. The suspicion surrounding him collapsed like many others before it. One year, a group of amateur investigators sent a letter to the department, insisting the killer must have been someone transient, someone passing through without leaving a trace. Their theory relied on broad generalizations and speculative links to crimes in other states. After reviewing the claims, the department dismissed them. Still, the conversations fueled tension in the community. People wanted answers. Even inaccurate theories seemed to offer temporary direction. By the early 2000s, the case had taken on the shape of a story without closure. Officers noted diminishing leads. The paper trail thickened while the actionable evidence thinned. The zipper ring remained an object without a home. The shoe impression photographs sat in files that no one had opened for months at a time. During a cold winter morning in 2004, the department held an internal meeting to review long-standing cases. When Lydia's name appeared on the list, a quiet heaviness filled the room. Officers exchanged looks, some sympathetic, some resigned. They discussed the feasibility of retesting certain evidence, but funding was tight and newer cases demanded attention. A decision was made, not in words but in the weary posture of the team. Lydia's case would remain open but inactive unless a substantial lead surfaced. When the meeting ended, the file was placed in a sealed box and moved to long-term storage. Jeffers walked it down the hallway himself. He set it on the metal shelf with a gentleness that felt out of place in such a utilitarian room. As he closed the storage door, he whispered something to no one in particular, something he hoped might count for something even if it changed nothing. He said he was sorry. Rainharbor carried on, reshaping itself around what had been lost. New families moved into houses near the park. Children who were not yet born in 1987 learned the story in fragments, warnings, and half-remembered details. The footbridge aged. The ravine remained as it always had, quiet, watchful, holding its secrets beneath layers of fallen needles. For many years, it seemed the case had grown still, as though it had settled permanently into the background noise of the town's collective memory. But files do not forget. They only wait. Time in Rainharbor does not rush. It settles quietly over the town like the coastal fog that drifts in every morning, softening edges, erasing urgency, leaving only what is meant to remain. In the months after Lydia's death, her family held on to anything that still felt solid. The routines of school, the predictable noise of shipyard shifts, the slow rhythm of seasons turning over the hillside. But grief has a way of reshaping even the most familiar things. It changes the way doors sound when they close. It alters how sunlight enters a room. It turns ordinary objects into markers of a life suspended. The Hart family kept Lydia's room largely the same for the first year. Her schoolbook stayed stacked on the desk. Her notebook lay beside them with the spine slightly bent from use. A sweater she wore the week before her disappearance hung over the back of her chair. None of these things were sacred in a ceremonial sense. They simply comforted the family in their stillness. They offered proof that she had been there, that her presence had weight and shape and texture before the world shifted. As months stretched into years, small changes began to appear. Her sisters grew taller. Their voices changed. New responsibilities filled their afternoons. One day, her mother realized she had not passed by Lydia's room in over a week. When she opened the door, dust motes floated upward like drifting remnants of memories she had forgotten to tend. She sat on the edge of the bed and whispered her daughter's name, almost out of habit. Her father coped differently. He went silent after the first anniversary, speaking only when necessary. Co-workers noticed he took longer breaks or paused more often when staring at the inlet. He never talked about what he saw in the ravine, though he replayed it endlessly in the privacy of his mind. The officers stepping down the slope, the way the light fell, the color of the leaves, the quiet after the news broke. His grief lived behind his ribs, sharp and unsaid. As the 1990s unfolded, Rainharbor changed with the times. New shops appeared in old storefronts. The shipyard added automated equipment. The hillside saw new houses rising along the roads that once led only to pockets of forest. With every change, Lydia's story became another layer beneath the town's newer concerns. But for the Hart family, the story never receded. It lived in the way they marked each year. It shaped how they talked to one another. It left a faint tension behind every holiday. Photos of Lydia began to fade slightly with age. The teal of her bicycle looked softer in the prints, though the memory of its brightness stayed sharp in her sisters' minds. When they reached high school, they found themselves describing Lydia to friends who had never met her. They struggled to capture something essential about her, the quiet steadiness that defied simplification. They often ended up describing her through small details, how she tied her shoelace twice for comfort, how she checked her bike before every ride, how she listened more than she spoke. Sometimes on Lydia's birthday, the family took her bike out of storage. They did not ride it. They simply cleaned it, tightening bolts and wiping dust from the frame. The action felt like tending to something alive, something that still held meaning. Sarah once said the bike felt like a promise they weren't ready to release. Megan said it felt like their childhood preserved in metal and memory. As the sisters left home one by one, Lydia's absence traveled with them. Sarah moved to a town 2 hours away. She kept a photo of Lydia on her dresser, the edges soft from being handled often. Megan moved to Oregon for work, carrying a folded page from Lydia's notebook in her bag. They built their adult lives around routines that sometimes felt too quiet, as though waiting for a voice that would never answer. Every year, they returned to Rainharbor for the memorial at Maple Crest Park. The town placed a small plaque near the trail entrance, engraved with Lydia's name and the dates the world knew her. Families new to the area often asked about the plaque. Longtime residents answered gently, in tones that held both reverence and fatigue. Over time, the memorials became smaller. Attendance thinned as people moved, aged, or shifted their focus to the demands of life. Still, the Hart family stood at the same spot each year. They watched as the ravine grew over in places, as saplings rose near the creek, as storms changed the contour of the path. They understood that nature erases gently, not out of cruelty, but because it does not understand the human need to hold on. In the early 2000s, a young journalist named Claire Morin developed an interest in unsolved cases from Washington's smaller towns. She came across Lydia's file while researching another story. The case struck her, the timeline, the absence of a reliable suspect, the quiet pain in the family's public statements. Claire reached out to the Hart family, asking if they might speak with her. At first they refused. But eventually, during a summer visit, Sarah agreed to meet. Their conversation lasted hours. Sarah spoke slowly at first, describing the day of the disappearance in careful detail. She talked about the bicycle, how Lydia had always cared for it. She talked about childhood routines, about how the park felt safe until it didn't. Claire listened, taking notes sparingly. She sensed the care required to handle a story like this. When the interview ended, she asked if she could pursue a broader investigation. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. It felt like something small shifting inside her, a willingness not to let this story sink into silence. Claire published an article about the case the following year. It did not sensationalize the tragedy. It focused on the enduring questions, on the unresolved threads, on the way justice can be delayed so long that it begins to feel abstract. The article gained moderate attention. Enough to revive conversation, not enough to produce substantial leads. Still, something had changed. Rainharbor was reminded of what it had lost. The article was pinned to the bulletin board at the police department for months. During this time, Lydia's mother developed a ritual. Once a month, she visited the ravine. She stood near the railing of the footbridge, looking down at the creek where the water moved quietly over stones. She never stayed long, but the visits became part of her life. She did not speak during these moments. She let the silence do the work. Her father attended fewer memorials as he aged. His health declined slowly but steadily, and he felt the weight of the years accumulate like sediment in a riverbed. He kept one item of Lydia's beside his bed, a photograph of her standing next to her bike, the wind lifting a strand of her hair. It was the last picture taken where she appeared entirely unburdened. As the family aged, the city changed around them. New families replaced old neighbors. The park added new playground equipment. A mural appeared near the trail entrance depicting scenes from Rainharbor's past, including a subtle reference to Lydia, an abstract figure riding a bicycle into a misty tree line. Some residents missed the meaning entirely. Others paused when passing it, feeling something familiar tug at them. In 2016, while reviewing stories for a local history exhibit, a city archivist reopened a box containing news articles and photographs from the 1980s. Among them was Claire Morin's interview with the Hart family. The archivist handed the file to a younger officer assigned to administrative duties. He read the article during a break and found himself lingering on the details. He brought the case to Detective Mara Ellison, who had a known interest in unresolved investigations. Ellison requested the old files, expecting to find little she could use. But as she flipped through the evidence logs and reports, she noticed something that had not been possible to act on decades earlier. DNA technology had advanced beyond anything the original detectives could have imagined. Methods now existed that could extract profiles from degraded samples or trace ancestry through distant relatives. She brought the file to her supervisor. They discussed feasibility, cost, and the likelihood of success. In the end, the department agreed to authorize a preliminary review. It did not promise answers. It promised only possibility, which was enough. On a winter evening, Ellison called the Hart family to inform them that the case was being evaluated for re-examination. Elaine listened in silence, then thanked her with a voice that carried both exhaustion and hope. Sarah and Megan exchanged messages that night, each admitting they had not allowed themselves to imagine progress in years. Outside, Rainharbor lay quiet beneath low drifting fog. The footbridge stood unchanged, weathered but steady, holding its place above the creek. The teal bicycle remained in storage at the Hart home, polished from time to time, its worn handlebars still shaped to fit the last hands that held them. In the quiet that followed Ellison's call, the family felt something they had not felt in decades. Not certainty, but a subtle stirring. A reminder that even after long silence, a story can rise again when someone is willing to listen. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop an emoji in the comments. For years, the evidence from Lydia Hart's case sat preserved inside temperature-controlled storage, sealed in paper envelopes that had grown brittle at the edges. Detectives passed the shelf often, sometimes pausing without touching anything, as if a respectful distance were part of what kept the case from collapsing entirely into memory. But when Detective Mara Ellison reopened the file in 2017, the first thing she felt was the weight, not physical, but historical. Everything inside the box had once been handled by people who believed they were racing against the clock. Now, decades later, the same items would step into a different world, one where technology had grown sharper, faster, and infinitely more patient. She carried the box to the Washington State Forensic Sciences Division early on a cold morning. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and plastic, a sterile contrast to the damp cedar scent that clung to her jacket. She signed the chain of custody forms, watching the technician's pen scratch across the paper. It felt ceremonial, almost reverent, as though the investigation itself were waking from a long, dreamless sleep. Inside the lab, Dr. Hannah Levitt laid the sealed envelopes out on a stainless steel table. Her posture shifted into a mode of deep concentration, the kind born from years of working with fragile evidence. She examined each bag as if greeting a familiar but distant acquaintance. The scrapings from the bark below the ravine, the fabric fibers from Lydia's shirt, the swabs collected from her skin. She handled each envelope slowly, deliberately, ensuring none were damaged in their 3 decades of stillness. With gentle hands, she began the process of rehydrating and extracting biological material nearly believed to be too degraded to be useful. The machines around her hummed at low, steady intervals. Capillary electrophoresis arrays ran in controlled cycles, transforming fragments of genetic material into patterns of fluorescent peaks. Levitt monitored each shift in the readouts, noting the increasing clarity that newer technology afforded her. Where older methods had produced noise, now she saw structure partial but promising. Detective Ellison stood nearby, hands clasped loosely in front of her, the tension visible only in the way her shoulders failed to relax. She did not interrupt. She simply waited, knowing breakthroughs did not arrive with dramatic fanfare, but with patient observation. Hours passed as the machines processed the samples. Levitt repeated the extraction multiple times, ensuring consistency. By late afternoon, she leaned closer to the monitor and exhaled through her teeth in a way Ellison had learned to interpret as cautious optimism. 17 loci appeared with unexpected clarity, far more than the incomplete profiles archived in the early 90s. "This is viable," Levitt said quietly. "More than viable, actually." Ellison's heartbeat quickened. "It's enough for a comparison?" "It's enough for something we couldn't do before." Levitt exported the data into a compact file encrypted for restricted use. The next step was delicate, sometimes controversial, but increasingly recognized for its power to solve cases previously thought unsolvable: forensic genetic genealogy. In a separate workspace, genealogist Daniel Reeve reviewed the profile with a blend of precision and passion that defined his career. His desk was cluttered with historical maps, family charts, and binders filled with public records. When Levitt handed him the file, he studied the numerical patterns quietly before uploading them into a genealogy matching platform built for law enforcement cases. The screen flickered with activity. A progress bar crawled slowly, mapping the DNA against millions of voluntarily contributed profiles. This was not about finding a direct match. It was about finding relatives' branches of a family tree that might eventually lead to the trunk. Then the matches appeared, second to third cousins. Distant relatives, but relatives nonetheless. Each one a thread that could be followed backward through marriages, births, migrations, and deaths. Reeve began assembling the tree, Every line he traced, every record he opened, added depth to the labyrinth of ancestry connected to the unknown individual whose DNA had been recovered from Lydia's clothing 30 years earlier. Patterns began to emerge. Family clusters repeated across counties in Washington. One particular lineage revealed a concentration of branches rooted directly in Rainharbor across several generations. Ellison leaned over his shoulder as he pointed to the cluster. "Whoever left that DNA," he said, "didn't just pass through Rainharbor. Their family lived here. They were part of this place." The significance of that detail settled into the room like a cold draft. It aligned with a suspicion that had lingered at the edges of the original investigation. Perhaps the danger had never come from outside. Reeve traced the branches narrowing toward living descendants. Several men matched the generational window: uncles, cousins, distant nephews. But one man stood out. His name appeared in census records, in school registries, in old neighborhood directories. Evan Mercer, born and raised in Rainharbor, 20 years old at the time of Lydia's death, living just blocks from the park. He had never been a suspect, not because he was absent, but because he never drew attention to himself. He lived quietly, moved without leaving notable footprints, blended into the routines of the town with a kind of practiced invisibility. Reeve forwarded the findings to Ellison with a measured nod. "He's the most probable source of the DNA, but we need confirmation." That confirmation came through a discreet operation conducted days later. Officers obtained a discarded coffee cup from Mercer after he left a convenience store. The item was rushed to the lab, where Levitt prepared the swabs with steady hands. The comparison process felt both clinical and momentous. Machines processed the samples through the night, cycling through algorithms created to detect even the most delicate correspondences. When morning arrived, the computer produced the match. A direct link, unmistakable, statistically overwhelming. The DNA taken from Lydia's clothing matched the sample collected from Mercer. Ellison stared at the screen, feeling the weight of 3 decades condense into a single moment of clarity. This was the forensic breakthrough the case had needed, the turning point that shifted everything from possibility to certainty. Yet even certainty brought questions. Why had he done it? How had he remained invisible? How many times had he walked past people who didn't know the history he carried? She thought of Lydia's bicycle, the way it had been placed so carefully by the fence, the angle of the wheel, the absence of panic in its positioning. That quietness, the stillness, felt aligned with the kind of person Mercer seemed to have been. Deliberate, observant, calculating in ways that hid themselves inside ordinary behavior. When Ellison visited the Hart family that evening, the reaction unfolded slowly, in layers. Elaine listened with both hands clasped tightly in front of her, as if grounding herself against the news. Sarah blinked rapidly, not from shock but from something deeper: relief tangled with sorrow. Megan pressed her fist to her mouth. "So it was someone from here," Elaine whispered. Ellison nodded. A long silence followed, the kind of silence that does not require filling. Outside the Hart home, dusk settled over Rainharbor. Porch lights flickered on one by one across the hillside, reflecting in the quiet surface of the inlet. A sense of something shifting moved through the town, subtle, tentative, like a breeze that hints at a coming storm but does not yet announce it. At the police department, officers gathered around the printed report. Some felt vindication. Others felt unease. All felt the gravity of the revelation. After decades of suspicion spreading in wide, unreliable arcs, the truth had narrowed itself to a single point, sharp and undeniable. Word spread quietly at first, then more boldly. Rainharbor, long shaped by uncertainty, now faced a new kind of reckoning. The knowledge that the girl whose name appeared on memorial plaques had been harmed by someone who once stood beside them in grocery lines, walked past them on sidewalks, and lived among them without suspicion. In the Hart home, Elaine placed Lydia's photograph on the table and whispered a simple sentence. Not an explanation. Not a farewell. Just an acknowledgement that after so many years, the silence had finally broken. And for the first time in decades, the possibility of justice felt real. Hit the like button if you believe justice always finds its way. The morning they arrested Evan Mercer, Rainharbor was wrapped in a thin sheet of coastal haze. The mist clung to the houses along Willow Bend Street, softening their edges, muting their colors, as though the town itself was bracing for what was about to unfold. Detective Mara Ellison stood on the narrow sidewalk leading to Mercer's home, watching as officers quietly took their positions. There was no desire for spectacle. The moment carried too much weight for that. When Mercer opened the door, he looked slightly disoriented, as if pulled from a dream he never expected to be interrupted. The officers read him his rights with calm precision. He did not struggle or protest. He simply lowered his gaze and nodded, a small motion that revealed nothing of what moved inside him. Neighbors watched from their windows. A few stepped out onto their porches, drawn by the commotion, yet unsure what to say or how to react. For many, his face was familiar. He was someone they had passed on morning walks, someone who stood in grocery lines and blended seamlessly into Rainharbor's quiet rhythms. As the patrol car pulled away, the town felt unsettled, its silence heavy with questions. Some wondered how they had not seen the truth sooner. Others questioned whether they had ever truly known the man behind the door. But for the Hart family, the news traveled with an entirely different weight, a confirmation that the person responsible had been near them all along, hidden in the fabric of their community. Ellison visited the Harts later that evening. She explained the charges, the DNA match, the genealogical tracing, and the steps that would follow. Elaine listened with a stillness that bordered on reverence, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Sarah sat beside her, blinking slowly, absorbing each word with deliberate care. Megan seemed unable to look away from the folder Ellison carried, as though it held answers she had chased for 30 years. "What happens now?" Elaine finally asked. "We move to trial," Ellison said gently. "There is enough evidence to proceed. The state will handle the prosecution." The trial began several months later in the Rain County Superior Court, a building whose brick exterior and narrow windows gave it the appearance of a place built to hold truth without ornament. Inside, the courtroom was bright but somber, lit by the overcast glow filtering through tall panes of glass. The seating was modest, rows of benches polished by decades of use. On them sat townspeople who remembered the original investigation, curious observers from neighboring counties, and journalists who had followed the story since the DNA breakthrough. The Hart family entered quietly, guided to their seats by a victim advocate. Each step felt ceremonial, not because they wanted it to be, but because the weight of the moment transformed even the simple act of walking into something profound. Elaine clutched a folded photograph of Lydia, a copy, worn from years in her purse. She held it close, but did not look at it. She already knew every detail by heart. When Mercer was brought into the courtroom, he kept his eyes forward. He appeared older than his years, as though the decades had hollowed something inside him. He did not search for familiar faces. He did not glance toward the Hart family. If he felt the gravity of what was happening around him, he showed no sign. His attorney maintained a steady presence beside him, preparing arguments that would ultimately be overshadowed by the clarity of the evidence. The prosecution presented the timeline with clinical precision. The day Lydia disappeared, the discovery in the ravine, the compromised early DNA samples, the re-extraction using modern methods, and the genealogical mapping that traced ancestry to the Mercer family line. The forensic biologist, Dr. Levitt, explained each step with careful restraint, allowing the data to speak for itself. The genealogist Reeve described the family tree that narrowed inevitably to Evan Mercer. Each witness added another stone to a structure that had taken more than 3 decades to build. The courtroom listened in stillness. At times, the silence felt absolute, as though even the air itself refused to move. Mercer's defense attempted to challenge the genealogy. suggesting the possibility of contamination or misinterpretation of ancestral matches. But the direct DNA sample collected from Mercer's discarded coffee cup matching the crime scene profile with overwhelming statistical certainty left little room for alternative explanations. The Hart sisters testified briefly. Their voices were steady as they recounted the last day they spent with Lydia, the bike ride to the park, the promise that she would return quickly. No theatrics, no embellishment. Just memory offered plainly, carrying its own quiet force. When they stepped down, the courtroom remained silent for several seconds, as if acknowledging the weight of what they had carried for so long. Elaine chose not to testify, but she attended every session. Her presence alone became a testament to endurance. Closing arguments came after weeks of testimony. The prosecutor's words were firm but measured, emphasizing not only the evidence, but the trust Lydia had believed in when she entered the park that day. Mercer's attorney spoke of reasonable doubt, but the argument felt thin against the accumulation of facts that had finally aligned after so many years. The jury deliberated for less than a day. When they returned, each step toward the bench felt slow, deliberate, echoing in the hearts of everyone in the room. The foreperson read the verdict in a voice that seemed to steady itself on each syllable, guilty on all counts. Elaine inhaled sharply, not a sob, not relief, but something between the two, a sound shaped by decades of waiting. Sarah reached for her hand. Megan bowed her head, closing her eyes as if replaying every moment of the journey that had brought them here. Mercer remained expressionless. Whether resignation or detachment moved behind his eyes, no one could say. After the courtroom emptied, Ellison stood beside the railing, watching the Hart family gather their belongings. She felt a quiet ache behind her sternum. This was justice, but justice delivered years too late always carried a bittersweet edge. Still, she believed in the significance of the moment, believed that truth, even delayed, offered a kind of healing. Outside, people spoke in hushed tones beneath the gray sky. Some felt relief, others felt sorrow. A few struggled to reconcile the idea that someone they once saw in ordinary places was capable of the violence that reshaped an entire community. Rainharbor, for all its familiarity, would never hold the same innocence it once did. That evening, the Hart family gathered at home. They sat around the living room table, Lydia's photograph resting between them. No long speeches, no declarations. Just a shared understanding that the world had shifted slightly toward balance, even if it could never return to what it was. Elaine placed her hand lightly on the picture and whispered a quiet acknowledgement. Not closure, because closure suggests an ending, but recognition. Recognition that truth had found them, that justice had spoken in its slow, unhurried voice. For the first time in years, the house felt less burdened by silence. Not empty, not healed, but steadier, anchored by the knowledge that Lydia's story was no longer suspended in uncertainty. And somewhere on the hillside above Rainharbor, the inlet reflected the faint glow of street lamps, carrying the sense of a town that had finally stepped out from beneath the long shadow of a secret. In the months after the verdict, Rainharbor moved with a quieter rhythm. People still walked the same streets and gathered at the same cafes, but a subtle shift lingered in the air. The weight the town had carried for decades had eased, not in celebration, but in acknowledgement. Truth, even when heavy, brings a different kind of stillness. The Hart family felt the change most deeply. Their home no longer held the suspended breath it once did. Grief would always live with them, but it no longer stood in the doorway, blocking every attempt to move forward. Elaine began tending her garden again, clipping back dead branches to make room for spring growth. Sometimes she paused, letting the sunlight fall across her hands, remembering how Lydia used to stand beside her, asking questions about every flower. Sarah and Megan visited more often, sharing quiet evenings filled with conversation instead of unspoken tension. Healing didn't come as a single moment. It arrived as small gestures, a shared meal, a repaired fence, a photograph moved from a drawer to a shelf. The town's sense of legacy changed, too. Younger residents learned Lydia's story not as a warning whispered between neighbors, but as a reminder of resilience. Schools spoke of the advances in forensic science, how persistence and innovation can reach through time to uncover the truth. A local teacher assigned a project about genetic genealogy, explaining gently how science had helped return a measure of justice to a girl the town refused to forget. On the hillside above Rainharbor, Maple Crest Park remained largely the same. The footbridge weathered another winter, its railings cool to the touch. The ravine still carried the sound of the creek as it threaded between stones. Nature, indifferent but steady, offered a quiet space for reflection. One afternoon, Elaine walked to the clearing near the trail entrance and stood beside the memorial plaque. She didn't bring flowers. She simply closed her eyes and let the breeze lift her hair. For the first time, the sound of the water didn't sting. It felt like a place returning to itself. Back at the Hart home, the teal bicycle sat in the garage, polished and carefully preserved. It had become more than an object. It was a symbol of the girl they loved, the girl who explored the world with calm curiosity. Sarah suggested donating it to a local youth center, but Megan hesitated. In the end, they kept it. Not as a reminder of tragedy, but as a reminder of who Lydia was: steady, bright, quietly present in the moments that mattered. Detective Ellison visited the family months after the trial. She brought no files, no updates, only a simple message. Thank you for allowing her to walk this path with them. They thanked her in return for giving them something they had almost stopped believing was possible. Justice had not erased the past, but it had given the future a gentler shape. Rainharbor may never completely shed the shadow of those early years, but it no longer carries it alone. The story has been woven into its history, transformed from a wound into a reminder of community, persistence, and the long, patient reach of truth. As spring approached, sunlight filtered through the evergreens in thin, golden lines. It settled across the path where Lydia once rode her bicycle, warming the ground in quiet intervals. In that soft light, there was no sense of finality, only the steady continuation of life, shaped by memory yet moving forward with grace. Which case should we tell next? Leave your suggestion below.